revolution, change, reform. These were the words we heard back in 1994 when Republicans swept into power, promising a new kind of governance. In his new book, Scot Faulkner talks about the administrative side of running the U.S. Capitol building. Coming right up, only on Roll Call TV.
From CN8 Studios on Capitol Hill, this is Roll Call with Robert Traynham.
And there you heard it, change, reform, revolution. Nearly 15 years ago, Republicans promised the American people that they would change how the U.S. Capitol building was being ran. More efficiency, less red tape, and no waste. So fast forward to today. Were those reforms implemented, and do they really work? Join us to talk about that and his new book is Scot Faulkner, the first Chief Administrative Officer of the U.S. House of Representatives and author of Naked Emperors, The Failure of the Republican Revolution. And joining me in the questioning is Lauren Whittington, a senior staff writer for Roll Call TV. Welcome to both of you. You know, Scott, you came to Washington many, many years ago, but in a more senior capacity as a director of personnel for the Reagan Bush administration in 1980, and obviously even more senior than that in 1994. But the title of your book is The Failure of the Republican Revolution, of which you were a part of in 1994. What happened?
What happened was that, like with any campaign cycle, the rhetoric and the reality are two different things. That members of Congress and the candidates who were running in 94 promised an awful lot of fundamental changes, and many of them really did not believe in those changes.
Lauren Whittington, you cover, obviously, politics for Roll Call newspaper. This is 2008, obviously. There is a lot of things that you must do in order to run the government efficiency. Based from where you sit, do you believe that the U.S. Congress is being ran in a very efficient way?
That's a loaded question. I think that if you want to compare how it's being run in 2008 versus how it was being run prior to 94.
Let's say 1988.
And 1988, even 1998, it's certainly more efficient. I mean, it's getting there just because that's the way everything in this country is moving. But I think you do still see, you know, the old vestiges of how things used to be done. I mean, we've had a couple instances where there have been problems with an enrolling clerk doing something wrong, and we had to actually do the Farm Bill twice because of some archaic situation where they have to use a certain type of parchment paper and those sort of things, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So it's certainly more efficient than it used to be, but we still have a little bit to go.
Scot Faulkner, you write in your book something very interesting, and it goes something like this. Just like a freshman dorm, the House is a mix of people, party animals, druggies, slackers, social climbing preppies, jocks, idealists, activists, and scholars. During my years in the House, I encountered close to 50% of members and staff displaying some form of addictive behavior. The addictions included ego, power, greed, drugs, and alcohol, and sex. That's some pretty, those are fighting words.
Oh, yes. But again, starting as an intern back in the 70s and then being a staffer for several members of Congress, in the 80s, coming back to the Hill as a head of congressional affairs for an agency, and then as CAO, I've seen it all. I mean, when you go to...
But Scott, this is the U.S. House of Representatives.
Yes,
These
indeed.
are individuals that are voting on, presumably, voting on pieces of legislation, and their staffs that obviously help them are voting on pieces of legislation that affect all of us, everyone that's watching here. So, I mean, you're calling them, that's a pretty strong terminology you're using here.
Oh, yes. But when I was up there as CAO, 34 members were going through drug rehab at any one time. I mean, and those are the good ones. I mean, they at least recognized they had an addiction problem. There were many others who were alcoholics and drug abusers who weren't going through rehab. Every week, I would get a stack, sometimes this tall, of court orders dealing with wage garnishments, bankruptcies, deadbeat dad issues for members and for the staff on the Hill. And so there's a lot of issues up there that aren't talked about.
You know, speaking of issues that are not talked about, there was an issue, I remember this very vividly, back in 1991, 1992, and that was the House banking scandal. And there was a group of individuals called the Gang of Seven that kind of rose to prominence to try to expose the House banking scandal. And what I understand about the House banking scandal was and is that there were members of Congress that were writing bad checks. They were writing checks, basically they were bouncing. There were checks that they were being written on where there wasn't enough money in their accounts to cover the funds.
Exactly.
And there was a cover-up. In other words, what the bank would do, the House bank would do, is say, oh, okay, Congressman X, you wrote a check for $2,500. You only had $1,500 in that account, but just pay us back whenever you get the opportunity.
Right.
That doesn't happen in the real world, but clearly it happened in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Sure. And one of the big problems that we encountered when we came in '94 was that you had large pools of general fund money that was covering a lot of bases. The check writing issue was one of them, but there were members up until we implemented a lot of the finance reforms were basically saying that they were being frugal when in fact they were dipping into all these hidden accounts to basically balance their books. And so we stopped that from happening. And this dealt with American Express cards, this dealt with the clerk hire, with the travel, with the franking privileges. I mean, every one of these, they were basically double dipping on taxpayers' money and then yet portraying themselves as being these good managers of public funds. And it was two different realities.
Lauren Whittington, from where you sit as a reporter for Roll Call newspaper, what was your paper's response to all of this mismanagement that was so apparent that you really couldn't deny that it was happening?
You're talking about the scandals in the 1990s. Actually, Roll Call was responsible for reporting a lot of what happened back then. It was back when we were some of the only people in town actually closely following what was going on the Hill. And so I think we were kind of instrumental and pivotal in the coverage of it. I'm kind of curious to ask you whether you think that, kind of going back to all of the scandal that was going on in the early 90s and then what you were talking about, members' specific personal problems, whether you think that they're, I don't know if you have personal knowledge of this, but whether you think that they're just as prevalent today and just not as well known or well talked about. I mean, we see, scandals flare up here and there. Mark Foley, obviously. And
the former congressman from Florida that resigned from office because of some alleged text messaging back and forth with underage individuals.
Yes, and there's been a few others that kind of flare up here and there, but we don't see stacks and stacks of 40-some members in rehab or kind of child wage or garnishment of wages. So I'm curious to.
Yeah. Well, I can guarantee you that the current CAO, Dan Beard, is probably signing documents still, because again, you're dealing with 14,000 employees between the staffers and the members, and like any small town, you have people who are deadbeat dads, people who are having wage garnishment issues, and so you're administering a small town.
Well, it's interesting you say a small town, because I think you said something else in your book. You basically call it almost like a science fiction world. In fact, this is what you said specifically.
Right.
A kind of science fiction world that politicians, lobbyists, journalists, and bureaucrats enter and most never leave. The insane laws, the absurd regulations, and the excess in spending flow from a sensory deprivation of real-world inputs. Those inside the Beltway actually believe that their every word and every deed is more important than anything done by anyone living outside this tiny world. Scott, again, these are fighting words.
Oh, yes.
And what's interesting about this is that this is the Congress.
Yes.
This is supposed to be arguably the most exclusive club, institution, whatever you want to call it, in the world, number one. Number two, these individuals are being held accountable, specifically the House of Representatives, because they are up on the ballot every 2 years. So you would assume that when Roll Call breaks this information, you would assume that when you write this information in your new book, that people would say, oh no, I can't vote for my representative anymore, I can't do this. But something else happens here. What happens?
It's the campaign cycle. I mean, that every member is packaged to their voters using the web, using television shows, ads, every campaign event. And so there's basically a suspension of belief or disbelief that starts to happen about this far out from a campaign. I mean, we know at the presidential level that Obama and McCain both have baggage, and it's a bubble, and that bubble is presented to, every campaign event is well staged, it's well scripted. Every interaction with a constituent is well staged, well scripted. Every letter is, I used to, when I was a junior staffer, write letters for members, and even people that you disagreed with, you say, keep your views in mind. So you're having all of this PR being poured out constantly.